Have you ever wondered what happens after we die? What if heaven is not just a place, but a journey where we learn the hidden meaning of our life? Today, we are going to explore the powerful story of The 5 People You Meet in Heaven by Mitch Albom. This book takes us on an emotional and thought-provoking adventure of a man named Eddie. Eddie lived a simple life, working as a maintenance man at an amusement park. But when he dies, he discovers that his life was much more important than he ever knew. In heaven, he meets 5 people, each with a lesson to teach him. Through their stories, Eddie begins to understand how every action, no matter how small, has an impact on the world. This story is about love, sacrifice, and the unseen connections between us all. Eddie was an old man, about 83 years old. He had worked at Ruby Pier, an amusement park, for most of his life. Every day he checked the rides, making sure they were safe. People passed by him without noticing. He was just the maintenance guy. But Eddie didn't mind. His life was simple, and he didn't expect anything more. But on this day, everything changed. It was Eddie's birthday. He sat in his usual place, watching the children laugh and play. Suddenly, a terrible accident happened. A ride at the park broke, and a cart came crashing down. A little girl was standing in its path. Eddie ran to save her. He reached out his hands. And then, everything went dark. Eddie was dead. But this was not the end. It was the beginning of something new. When Eddie opened his eyes, he was in a strange, peaceful place. He felt young again. No pain, no old body, just a sense of calm. He was in heaven, but why was he here? What was going to happen next? Then, he saw someone waiting for him, the first person he would meet in heaven. Who was this person? And what lesson would Eddie learn? Eddie stood in a strange place. It was quiet, peaceful. The sky was a deep blue, like the ocean stretching forever. He felt different. His body was no longer old. His legs did not hurt. His hands were not rough from years of work. He felt light, almost floating. Then he saw a man in the distance. The man was standing near a carnival tent, just like the ones from Eddie's childhood. He wore a blue uniform and had pale skin, almost like he was made of wax. Eddie looked closer and gasped. He remembered this face. It was the Blue Man. Years ago, when Eddie was a little boy, he had seen the Blue Man at the freak show in Ruby Pier. The Blue Man had a strange, silvery blue skin color because of a medical condition. People came to stare at him in the tent, calling him different, calling him strange. But to Eddie, he was just another person working at the amusement park. The Blue Man smiled at Eddie and spoke gently. "You have arrived," he said. Eddie was confused. "Where am I?" "You are in heaven," the Blue Man said, "and I am here to teach you something." Eddie shook his head. He had never been close to the Blue Man. "Why are you the first person I meet?" he asked. "I don't even know you." The Blue Man nodded. "That is the first lesson," he said. "In life, we are all connected in ways we cannot see." Eddie still did not understand. Then the blue man told him a story from many years ago, when Eddie was just a little boy. One day, young Eddie was playing with a ball in the street. He did not see a car coming. At the last second, he ran in front of the car to grab his ball. The driver, startled, swerved the car to avoid hitting Eddie. The car did not crash, and Eddie ran away, never thinking about it again. But the driver of that car was the blue man. Because of the sudden swerve, the blue man lost control of the car. His heart started beating too fast. His hands shook. He barely made it to the side of the road before his heart gave out. He died that day. Eddie stared in shock. "I caused your death?" The blue man smiled gently. "It was not your fault," he said. "You were just a child. But this is what I want you to learn. Every action, even small ones, can affect others in ways we do not see. Life is full of invisible connections. Your life touched mine, just as my life now touches yours." Eddie felt a strange feeling in his chest. He had never thought about that moment from his childhood again. He had never known what happened to the driver of the car. And now, after so many years, he was learning the truth. The blue man continued, "There are no random acts. Everything you do matters. Every choice you make connects to others in ways you cannot imagine." Eddie thought about his life. How many times had his actions affected someone without him knowing? Had he helped someone? Had he hurt someone? He had never thought about it before. The blue man took a deep breath. "I have told you my story. Now I must go." Eddie felt a deep sadness. He wanted to ask more questions. He wanted to say he was sorry. But the blue man simply smiled and faded away. Eddie was alone again. But now he understood something new. Life was not just about him. Every person, every action, every moment was connected like invisible threads in a giant web. And this was only the beginning of his journey in heaven. Eddie stood in the quiet, empty space where the blue man had disappeared. His mind was full of thoughts. He had never realized how one small action from his childhood had changed another person's life forever. If one small moment could have such an effect, how many other things had happened in his life that he never understood? Before he could think more, the world around him started to shift. The deep blue sky faded. The amusement park disappeared. Suddenly, he was standing in a different place. He was in the middle of a battlefield. The air was hot and dry. Smoke rose from burned trees. The ground was covered in dirt and broken pieces of metal. Eddie felt a strange fear inside him. He had been here before. This was not just any battlefield. This was the war. Years ago, when Eddie was young, he had been a soldier. He had fought in World War II, and he had seen things that haunted him for the rest of his life. Now he was back. But why? Then he heard footsteps. Eddie turned and saw a man walking toward him. The man was wearing an army uniform. His face was calm but serious. His eyes were sharp, full of wisdom and sadness at the same time. Eddie's heart started beating faster. He knew this man. It was the captain. During the war, Eddie had been part of a small unit of soldiers. The captain was their leader. He was strong, brave, and always took care of his men. Eddie had trusted him with his life. And now, here he was again, standing in front of Eddie just like in the old days. The captain nodded. "You look good, soldier," he said. Eddie felt a lump in his throat. "Captain, what is this? Am I dreaming?" The captain shook his head. "No, Eddie, this is real, and I am here to teach you something." Eddie looked around at the battlefield. He felt the old memories rising in his mind. The war had been the hardest time of his life. He had seen friends die. He had been captured by the enemy. He had spent months as a prisoner. And then there was the fire. The night everything changed. The captain could see the questions in Eddie's eyes. He sighed and looked out at the burned land around them. "You remember what happened here, don't you?" he asked. Eddie nodded slowly. "We were prisoners," he said. "We were locked in a hut, forced to work like animals. We planned an escape." The captain nodded. "That's right. We fought our way out. We killed the guards. We set fire to their camp." Eddie's hands started to shake as the memories became clearer. He remembered the fire. He remembered running through the flames. But there was something else, something that had stayed in his mind for years. He had always felt like something was wrong, like something had happened that night that he could never explain. The captain looked directly into Eddie's eyes. "Tell me what you remember next," he said. Eddie took a deep breath. "I was running," he said. "The fire was everywhere. The heat was so strong I could barely breathe." His voice grew quieter. "And then, I thought I saw something, a shadow, a person." The captain nodded slowly. "Go on." Eddie swallowed. "I thought I saw a child." His voice broke. "I thought I heard crying." For years, Eddie had tried to push this memory away. He had never told anyone, but in his heart, he had always believed that there was someone in that burning hut, a child, and he had run away, leaving them behind. The captain took a step closer. "Eddie," he said gently, "I need to tell you something. That night, when we escaped, I made sure every man got out safely." Eddie looked at him, confused. "But I always thought," the captain took a deep breath, "you didn't leave anyone behind, Eddie. But something else happened that you never knew." Eddie felt a cold fear in his chest. "What do you mean?" The captain's face became serious. "That night after we escaped, you ran ahead of the group. The fire was everywhere. And then you stepped into the road." He paused. "You didn't see it, but I did. There was a landmine." Eddie's breath caught in his throat. The captain continued. "You would have died that night, Eddie, but I couldn't let that happen. He looked straight into Eddie's eyes. "So I stepped in front of you." Eddie's mind went blank. He tried to speak, but no words came out. The captain gave a small, sad smile. "That's how I died, soldier. The landmine exploded. I was gone instantly." Eddie felt like the ground beneath him had disappeared. He had spent his whole life thinking about the child in the fire. He had blamed himself, but he had never known the truth. The captain put a hand on Eddie's shoulder. "This is the lesson I want you to learn," he said. "Sacrifice is a part of life. It's not something to regret. It's something to understand." Eddie felt tears in his eyes. You died for me," he whispered. The captain nodded. "That was my choice, just like I would have done for any of my men." He looked out at the battlefield. A soldier does not always get to go home, but a soldier can make sure someone else does. Eddie thought about all the years he had spent wondering, blaming himself. He had carried guilt for so long, but now he knew the truth. The captain had saved him. The captain had given his life so Eddie could live. The captain took one last look at the battlefield. Then he turned back to Eddie. "It's time for me to go," he said. "You have more to learn." Eddie watched as the captain began to fade. The battlefield around him started to disappear. But before the captain was completely gone, Eddie heard his voice one last time. "I died so you could live, Eddie," he said. "Now it's your turn to understand why." And then he was gone. Eddie stood in silence. The battlefield had disappeared, and so had the captain, but the words still echoed in his mind. Sacrifice is a part of life. The captain had given his life to save him, and Eddie had never known. He had spent years feeling guilty about the fire, blaming himself for something he didn't even do. Now he understood the truth. But before he could think more, the world around him changed again. The ground beneath him softened. The air became warm, filled with the scent of salt and water. Eddie looked up and saw the ocean stretching far and wide. Gentle waves moved back and forth, glistening under the golden sun. He was standing on a shore, the sand soft beneath his feet. This place felt different. It was peaceful, calming. The war had been rough and painful, but this place felt like a memory from a happy time. Eddie looked around, trying to understand where he was, and then he saw her. A woman was standing by the water's edge. She was wearing a long dress, flowing in the breeze. Her dark hair was pulled back, and her face was kind, full of warmth. She was not young, but she was beautiful in a way that time could not change. Eddie felt something deep inside his heart. He knew this woman. It was Marguerite. Eddie's chest tightened. His wife, his love, the only woman he had ever truly cared about. She had been gone for many years, but now here she was, standing in front of him, just as he remembered her. He wanted to run to her, to hold her, but his feet felt heavy. He had spent so many years without her. He had missed her every single day, and now he was afraid that if he reached for her, she might disappear like the others. But Marguerite smiled gently and took a step forward. "Eddie," she said softly. Eddie swallowed hard. "Marguerite," he whispered. She looked at him with eyes full of love. "I have been waiting for you." Eddie felt something break inside him. All the years of loneliness, all the nights he had spent remembering her, all the pain of losing her. It all came rushing back at once. "I've missed you so much," he said, his voice shaking. She nodded. "I know." Eddie looked at her face, trying to take in every detail. "Is this real?" he asked. "Am I really seeing you?" Marguerite smiled. "This is heaven, Eddie, and in heaven, love does not end." Eddie took a deep breath. He had spent years believing that death had separated them forever. He had believed that once someone was gone, they were truly gone. But now, standing in front of Marguerite, he wasn't so sure anymore. She gestured for him to walk with her. They strolled along the shore, the waves gently touching their feet. The sun was warm, but not too hot. The sky was clear, endless. It felt like a place where time did not exist. Marguerite looked at Eddie. "Do you remember when we met?" she asked. Eddie smiled a little. "Of course I do." He closed his eyes and let the memory fill his mind. They had met at a carnival right there at Ruby Pier. She was with her friends, and Eddie had been working one of the rides. He had never believed in love at first sight, but the moment he saw her, something had changed inside him. She was different. She was special. Marguerite laughed softly. "You were so nervous," she said. "You dropped your wrench right in front of me." Eddie chuckled. "I didn't know what to say." She nodded. "But you found the words, and you never stopped finding them." Eddie looked at her. "I loved you from the very first moment." Marguerite's eyes softened. "And I loved you." They walked in silence for a moment, letting the memory surround them. Then Marguerite stopped and looked at Eddie again. "I have something to tell you," she said. Eddie felt his heart tighten. "What is it?" She took a deep breath. "I know you were angry when I left." Eddie looked down. He couldn't deny it. When Marguerite had died, he had felt lost. He had felt cheated, like life had taken her too soon. He had spent years asking why. Why did she have to go? Why did he have to live without her? He had tried to move on, but nothing ever felt the same. Marguerite touched his hand. "You thought our love was over when I died." Eddie looked at her. "Wasn't it?" She shook her head. "No, Eddie. Love does not end. It does not stop just because life does." Eddie felt a lump in his throat. "But you were gone. I couldn't talk to you. I couldn't hold you." Marguerite nodded. "I know. But love is more than just being together. It is what stays even when someone is gone. It is what you carry inside you." Eddie thought about all the years he had spent missing her. All the nights he had wished she was still there. He had believed that love ended with death. But now, standing here with her, he wondered if he had been wrong. Marguerite looked at him gently. "You never let yourself love again." Eddie stiffened. He didn't like thinking about that. After Marguerite died, he had shut himself away. He had lived his life alone, working at Ruby Pier, going through the same routine every day. He had never tried to love again because he felt like no one could replace her. "I didn't want to," he said quietly. Marguerite nodded. "I understand, but love is not meant to be locked away. It is meant to be shared." Eddie felt a deep ache inside him. "I didn't know how." She touched his face gently. "It's okay, but I want you to understand something, Eddie. Love is not lost. It is never lost." Eddie closed his eyes, letting her words sink in. All these years, he had thought he had lost Marguerite forever. But maybe she had never truly left. Maybe she had always been with him, in the way he remembered her laugh, in the way he still spoke to her in his mind, in the way he had carried her love inside him every single day. Marguerite smiled. "That is the lesson I want you to learn. Love does not die. It is always there, even when you cannot see it." Eddie looked at her, feeling something shift inside him. The pain of losing her would never completely go away. But now, for the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace. Marguerite took a step back, her image becoming softer, like a reflection in the water. Eddie felt his chest tighten again. He didn't want her to go. She smiled gently. "I have always been with you, Eddie," she said, "and I always will be." Then, just like the blue man and the captain before her, she faded away, leaving Eddie alone on the shore. But this time he didn't feel lost. He didn't feel empty, because now he understood. Love never truly leaves. It stays in the heart, in the memories, in the way it changes a person forever. Eddie stood on the shore, feeling the warmth of Marguerite's presence still around him. Even though she was gone, something inside him felt lighter. He had spent years believing love had left him, but now he understood. It had never left. It had always been a part of him. As he stood there, the ocean waves faded away. The golden sky darkened. The soft sand beneath his feet disappeared. Slowly, his surroundings changed once again. The air became thick, heavy. He found himself standing in a strange place, surrounded by darkness and shadows. It felt like he was indoors. Inside a vast and empty building, there was a faint glow in the distance. He stepped forward, walking toward the light. As he moved, he began to hear soft murmurs, the echoes of voices. It was as if the walls around him were filled with whispers. Then he saw her. A woman stood near the glow, her back turned toward him. She was wearing a long, elegant dress, and her dark hair was neatly pinned up. There was something graceful about her, something refined. Eddie could tell she was from a different time. As he approached, the woman slowly turned around. Her face was strong yet kind. Her eyes filled with wisdom. She looked at him with an expression that held both sadness and understanding. "Hello, Eddie," she said gently. Eddie frowned. He didn't recognize her. "Who are you?" he asked. She studied him for a moment, as if deciding how to answer. "My name is Ruby," she said. Eddie blinked. The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. "Ruby?" he repeated. She nodded. "Yes, Ruby, as in Ruby Pier." Eddie's breath caught in his throat. Ruby Pier, the amusement park where he had spent his entire life. The place where he had worked, where he had lived, and where he had died. The place that had shaped him. Ruby gave him a small smile. "I am the reason your home was built," she said. Eddie stared at her in confusion. "What do you mean?" She looked around the vast, shadowy space they were standing in. "Do you know where we are?" she asked. Eddie glanced around. The walls were old, cracked, as if they had survived years of fire and smoke. The air smelled of ash and something bitter. He felt a deep sense of sadness in this place, as if it held painful memories. Ruby spoke softly. "We are inside a diner," she said. "It was once a grand place. My husband, Emile, built it with love. He wanted it to be a place where people could gather, where they could laugh and enjoy life. But then, one night, everything changed." Eddie listened closely as she continued. "There was a fire. It spread quickly, consuming everything in its path. Emile and I barely escaped, but we lost everything. The diner, our dreams, our happiness. It was all gone." She looked at Eddie with sad eyes. "That fire led my husband to make a decision. He needed to rebuild, to start again. And so he bought land by the ocean. He built an amusement park there, hoping to bring joy back into his life. That park, Eddie, was Ruby Pier." Eddie felt his heart pound. "You mean?" She nodded. "Yes, the place where you spent your entire life. The place you called home. It was never meant to be yours. It was born from tragedy." Eddie felt his knees go weak. All his life, he had thought of Ruby Pier as just a job, a routine, a place that trapped him. He had blamed the park for keeping him there, for making him feel small. But now, standing before Ruby, he realized something he had never considered. The park had not been a curse. It had been a gift, a second chance for someone else's dreams to live on. Ruby stepped closer. "I have watched you, Eddie," she said. "I have seen your pain, your anger. I know you felt stuck at Ruby Pier. I know you wanted to leave. But I need you to understand something." Eddie swallowed hard. "What?" Ruby took a deep breath. "Sometimes we are placed in a life we do not choose. Sometimes we feel trapped, as if we were meant for something bigger. But every life has purpose. Every path matters. You were not at Ruby Pier by accident." Eddie felt something tighten in his chest. "But I wanted more," he whispered. "I wanted to escape." Ruby nodded. "I know, and it is okay to dream of something more. But your life had meaning, Eddie. You may not have seen it, but you were exactly where you were meant to be." Eddie shook his head. "I was just a maintenance worker." Ruby's eyes softened. "You were more than that. You kept people safe. You fixed things. You watched over children, families, strangers. How many lives did you protect without even knowing?" Eddie felt tears sting his eyes. He had spent years believing his life was small, unimportant. But Ruby was telling him something else. She gestured around them. "This diner was once my home. The fire took it away. But from that fire, something new was born. The park you worked at, the place you thought was holding you back. That place brought happiness to thousands. And you, Eddie, were part of that." Eddie let her words sink in. For the first time, he looked back at Ruby Pier with different eyes. Maybe it had not been a prison. Maybe it had been a place where he had made a difference. Ruby reached out and touched his arm gently. "It is time to let go of your anger, Eddie," she said. "Your life was not wasted. It had meaning. It had purpose." Eddie felt his body tremble. All these years, he had carried resentment in his heart. He had blamed Ruby Pier for trapping him, for taking away his dreams. But now he realized the truth. Ruby Pier had not stolen his life. It had shaped it. Eddie stood in silence, his mind heavy with the weight of Ruby's words. He had spent his whole life thinking of Ruby Pier as a burden, something that had held him back. But now he saw it differently. It had been part of something bigger, something that had started long before he was even born. Ruby looked at him with gentle eyes. "I want to show you something," she said. Suddenly, the walls of the diner faded away. The smoke, the cracked windows, the whispers of the past. All of it disappeared. In their place, Eddie saw something new. It was a hospital room. The air smelled of medicine and disinfectant. The walls were plain, the lights dim. Eddie turned his head and saw a man lying in a hospital bed. His face was pale, his breathing shallow. His body looked frail, as if life had already drained most of his strength. Eddie frowned. He didn't recognize the man. But then, Ruby stepped closer to the bed. She reached down and touched the man's hand gently. "This is my husband, Emil," she said softly. "This is where he spent the last days of his life." Eddie looked at the man again. His skin was thin, his hair gray. He looked as if he had carried the weight of sorrow for many years. Ruby continued, "The fire at the diner destroyed everything we had built. It broke Emil's heart. He spent the rest of his years rebuilding Ruby Pier. But deep inside, he always felt the pain of what he had lost." She turned to Eddie. "Do you see, Eddie? Pain does not belong to one person alone. Sometimes, the things we resent the most, the things we think are ours to suffer, have a history we do not understand. Eddie felt a strange sadness for the man in the bed. He had never thought about the people behind Ruby Pier, the ones who had built it, the ones who had given their lives to it. He had always seen it as just a job, a place where he was stuck. But for Emil it had been a dream. Ruby continued speaking. I know you felt trapped at Ruby Pier. I know you thought it was unfair that you had to stay. But the truth is, Eddie, it was never just about you. This place was built from loss, from sacrifice. It was built from someone else's pain. Long before you arrived. Eddie swallowed hard. He thought about all the times he had cursed his life, all the moments he had wished for something different. He had never once considered that he had been walking through someone else's story, someone else's loss. Ruby looked at him with kindness. I tell you this because I want you to let go of your resentment. You carried anger with you your whole life. Eddie, you believed you were stuck in a place you did not choose. But the truth is, you were exactly where you were meant to be. Eddie felt something shift inside him. It was not an easy thing to accept. He had spent years believing he had been cheated by life, that his dreams had been stolen. But Ruby was telling him that his life had been part of something bigger, that he had been connected to a story he never even knew. He looked at Emil one last time. The man's face was peaceful now, as if the pain of the past no longer mattered. Eddie took a deep breath. He still did not have all the answers, but one thing was clear. He could no longer see Ruby Pier the way he once had. Ruby turned to him one last time. You have to understand, Eddie, she said. The place where you spent your life was not a mistake. It was not a prison. It was a place where lives crossed, where stories connected. And you, Eddie, were part of it all. Eddie felt the air around him shift again. The hospital room, the bed, the smell of medicine. All of it faded away. He was moving once more, leaving behind the past, stepping into something new. Eddie felt himself being pulled away again. The world around him changed. The air grew warmer, filled with the scent of trees and earth. The sounds of birds echoed in the distance. He looked down and saw that he was standing on soft, damp grass. He was in the middle of a forest. The trees stretched high into the sky, their branches swaying gently. Sunlight peeked through the leaves, creating golden patches on the ground. There was a small stream nearby, the water clear and calm. It was peaceful, almost dreamlike. Eddie turned his head and saw a figure sitting on a rock by the water. A man with dark skin, a shaved head, and deep, tired eyes. He wore a simple uniform, old and worn, as if from a time long ago. His hands rested on his knees, and he stared at Eddie with quiet understanding. Eddie felt something stir inside him. He knew this man. He had seen him before in a different place, a different time. And then, suddenly, the memory came rushing back. The war, the burning village, the night in captivity. Eddie took a slow step forward. You, he said softly. The man gave him a small nod. "Hello, soldier," he said. His voice was steady, calm, but there was something in it, something heavy, something knowing. Eddie swallowed hard. His time in the war was something he had tried to forget, something he had buried deep inside himself. He had spent so many years pushing it away, refusing to talk about it. But now, standing here, face to face with this man, the memories came back like waves crashing against the shore. The man gestured toward a spot beside him on the rock. Eddie hesitated, then walked over and sat down. The sound of the stream filled the silence between them. The man looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "You never knew my name," he said. Eddie shook his head. "No," he admitted. The man nodded, as if he had expected that answer. "My name was Tala." Eddie blinked. The name was unfamiliar. He had thought the man might be one of the soldiers from his unit, someone he had fought beside. But Tala, it was not a name he recognized. Tala watched him carefully. "Do you remember the fire?" he asked. Eddie felt his heart tighten. The fire, the village, the hut that had burned. He had tried to forget. He had told himself that what happened that night was necessary, that it was war, that he had done what he had to do. But now, in this quiet, peaceful place, he could not run from it anymore. Eddie lowered his head. "Yes," he whispered. Tala's expression did not change. He did not seem angry. He did not seem surprised. He simply nodded, as if he already knew. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Eddie could hear the rustling of the trees, the gentle ripple of the stream, and then, finally, Tala spoke again. "You did not see me," he said softly, "but I was there." Eddie felt a chill run down his spine. He lifted his head and looked into Tala's deep, knowing eyes. "I was in the hut," Tala said. Eddie felt the air leave his lungs. His hands trembled. His body tensed. "No," he said quickly, shaking his head. "That's not possible." But Tala did not look away. He did not waver. "I was there," he said again. "A little girl, hiding." Eddie's mind spun. The night in the village had haunted him for years. But he had convinced himself that no one had been inside that hut. He had told himself it was empty, that he had seen shadows, nothing more. But now, Tala was telling him the truth. A little girl, trapped inside. Eddie's chest ached. His throat tightened. "No," he whispered again, his voice barely a breath. "I didn't know. I didn't see you." Tala tilted his head. "You were a soldier," he said. "You did what soldiers do." Eddie clenched his fists. He had told himself that same thing for years. He had tried to believe it, but hearing it now from Tala made it sound different. It did not feel like an excuse. It felt like a wound being reopened, a truth he had refused to face. Tala reached down and touched the water in the stream. He ran his fingers through it, letting the ripples spread. "You carried this with you," he said, "all your life. The pain, the guilt." Eddie could not speak. His heart was pounding. Tala turned to him again. "It is time to wash it away." Eddie felt his breath hitch. He looked at the water, at the way it moved, at the way it flowed without stopping. He thought about all the years he had spent carrying this weight, the burden of war, the guilt of what he had done. And then, for the first time, he let himself feel it. The sorrow, the regret, the truth. Tears welled in his eyes. He had spent so many years believing that the war had taken something from him. His leg, his peace, his dreams. But now, he realized something else. He had taken something too. A life. Tala watched him quietly, waiting. He did not blame Eddie. He did not accuse him. He simply let him face the truth. Eddie looked down at the water again. He reached out with a shaking hand and dipped his fingers in. The coolness spread through his skin. It felt like a cleansing, like something washing over him. Through him, for years, he had held on to guilt without even realizing it. He had let it harden inside him, turning into anger, turning into pain. But now, in this quiet place, he understood. He could not change the past, but he could let go. He closed his eyes. He let the water run through his fingers. And for the first time in his life, he allowed himself to forgive. Eddie sat in silence, his fingers still touching the water. The coolness of the stream ran over his skin, and for the first time in years, he felt something inside him loosen. The weight he had carried for so long, the guilt, the regret, began to slip away like water flowing over rocks. Tala watched him with quiet understanding. She had not blamed him. She had not yelled or punished him. Instead, she had shown him the truth, and now she was waiting for him to accept it. Eddie lifted his eyes to her. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice quiet. Tala gave him a small, sad smile. She reached down and scooped up a handful of water, letting it drip through her fingers. "Now," she said softly, "you wash away the pain." Eddie frowned, not fully understanding. Tala gestured to the stream. "Come," she said. He hesitated, then slowly moved forward. The water was shallow, just deep enough to reach his knees. He stepped in carefully, feeling the soft mud beneath his feet. The water swirled around his legs, cool and soothing. Tala followed him. She knelt down and cupped the water in her hands again. Then, without a word, she reached out and began to rub the water over Eddie's arms. He watched as she moved her small hands in gentle circles, washing his skin, his scars. Eddie felt something shift inside him. It was as if, with each movement, she was wiping away something more than dirt. She was wiping away years of anger, years of sorrow. He swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he whispered. Tala nodded. I know. Eddie looked down at her small hands, at the way they worked so gently, so patiently. He thought about his life, about all the years he had spent in bitterness. He had blamed the war. He had blamed fate. He had blamed everyone and everything. But deep inside, he had also blamed himself. Tala scooped up more water and placed her hand over Eddie's heart. The coolness seeped into his skin, and something inside him cracked. A memory rushed forward, one he had buried deep. The night the village burned, the heat of the flames, the shouts of soldiers, the panic. Eddie had been injured, weak, desperate to escape. He had seen the hut, the shadows flickering inside. He had thought, he had convinced himself. It was empty, but it had not been. Tala had been inside. His breath came in short gasps. I didn't know, he whispered again. Tala nodded. But you felt it. Eddie's hands trembled. Yes, he had felt it. He had spent his life feeling it, without even realizing. The anger, the restlessness. It had been guilt all along, a hidden wound that had never healed. Tala took his hands in hers. You were a good man, she said. Eddie's eyes stung. He had never thought of himself that way. He had been an ordinary man, living an ordinary life. He had never done anything great, never been anyone important. I was just a maintenance worker, he muttered. Tala tilted her head. But you kept children safe, she said. Eddie frowned. What do you mean? She smiled, a small, knowing smile. Your hands made rides work. Your hands kept children laughing. Eddie blinked. His whole life, he had thought his work didn't matter. He had thought fixing rides was nothing special. But now, standing here, he saw it differently. He had saved people. He had protected them. He had given children a place to feel joy. Tala looked up at him, her dark eyes shining. You kept me safe too, she said. Eddie's breath caught. But I... Tala placed a hand over his heart again. You took my pain, she said. Now let it go. Eddie felt the weight in his chest, the tightness that had been there for so long. He closed his eyes, letting the water surround him. He breathed in deeply, and then, slowly, he let it out. The guilt, the sorrow, the burden. He let it all go. Tala smiled, stepping back. The water around them shimmered, glowing with soft light. Eddie looked down at his arms, at his chest, the scars, the dirt, the pain. It was all washing away. He looked up at Tala, and for the first time in his life he felt light. He felt free. Eddie stood in the glowing water, feeling lighter than he ever had before. The pain he had carried for so many years was fading, dissolving into the stream that surrounded him. He looked at Tala, who watched him with quiet eyes, her small hands resting at her sides. For the first time in his life, he understood. He had not been a failure. He had not been useless. His life had mattered in ways he had never imagined. Tala gestured to the shore, and Eddie stepped out of the water. As he moved, he realized something had changed. The stiffness in his legs was gone, the ache in his back, the weight in his heart. None of it was there anymore. He felt strong. He felt new. Tala walked ahead of him, leading him toward a field of soft grass. The air was warm, carrying the scent of fresh earth and flowers. Eddie followed her, feeling the gentle breeze against his skin. He looked down at his hands, his arms. The scars from his old injuries were gone. His body was no longer worn and tired. He was young again. Tala turned to face him. "You have one more person to meet," she said. Eddie's heart skipped. Another person. Who could it be? He had already met 4 souls in heaven, each one teaching him something important about his life. The blue man had shown him that all lives are connected. The captain had taught him about sacrifice. Ruby had helped him let go of anger. Tala had made him understand the truth about his past. Who was left? Tala smiled softly and pointed ahead. Eddie followed her gaze. In the distance, a figure was waiting. The person was sitting on a bench beneath a tree, their back turned toward him. The leaves of the tree shimmered, reflecting golden light. Eddie hesitated, his heart pounding. There was something familiar about the figure. He couldn't see their face, but a feeling stirred inside him. Something deep, something old. Tala touched his arm gently. "Go," she said. Eddie swallowed hard and stepped forward. As he walked, the air seemed to hum around him. His footsteps made no sound. The closer he got, the more his chest tightened. Then, finally, the figure turned. Eddie froze, his breath caught in his throat. He felt as if the world around him had stopped moving. It was Marguerite, his wife, his love. She was young, just as she had been when they first met. Her dark hair was pinned back, her brown eyes warm and filled with light. She was wearing a simple dress, the kind she had worn in the early days of their marriage. Eddie's knees nearly gave out. He had dreamed of her so many times. He had missed her every single day since she had passed. And now here she was. Marguerite smiled, tilting her head. "Hello, Eddie." Eddie felt his chest tighten. He wanted to speak, but his throat was too thick with emotion. He took another step, then another, until he was standing right in front of her. He reached out, hesitating for a moment, then gently touched her cheek. She was real. She was here. Tears filled his eyes. "I missed you," he whispered. Marguerite placed her hand over his. "I know," she said softly. Eddie closed his eyes, letting himself feel the warmth of her touch. All the years of loneliness, of longing, they melted away in that moment. He had always believed heaven would be a place of golden gates, of endless skies and angelic music. But this was heaven, being with her again, holding her, For the first time since he had died, he felt truly at peace. Marguerite squeezed his hand gently. "Come," she said. She led him to the bench, and they sat together beneath the golden tree. The leaves rustled softly, and in the distance, Eddie could hear the faint sound of music. It was a melody he recognized, a song from the days of the carnival, from the nights he had danced with Marguerite under the twinkling lights. They sat in silence for a while, simply enjoying each other's presence. Eddie didn't need to speak, neither did she. They had spent so many years apart. But now, in this place, time no longer mattered. Finally, Marguerite turned to him. "Do you understand why you're here?" she asked. Eddie looked at her, confused. "I'm here because of you," he said. She smiled, but there was something sad in her expression. "Not just because of me," she said gently. Eddie frowned. "Then why?" Marguerite reached out and took his hands in hers. "Because love," she said, "does not end when life does." Eddie felt something stir inside him. Marguerite continued, her voice soft and steady. "Love is not lost, doesn't fade, stays. It changes form, but it never disappears." Eddie thought about all the years he had spent without her, the empty nights, the quiet mornings. He had thought love had been stolen from him when she died. But now, hearing her words, he realized something. He had never truly lost her. She had been with him all along, in the memories, in the quiet moments, in the way he had carried her love. Even when she was gone, tears slipped down his face. I thought I would never see you again," he admitted. Marguerite squeezed his hands. "I never left you," she said. "Not really." Eddie closed his eyes, letting her words sink in. She had always been there, in his heart, in his love for her, in the way he had lived, even after she was gone. He opened his eyes and looked at her, truly looked at her. She was as beautiful as he remembered. Her eyes were filled with warmth, her smile gentle and kind. Eddie had spent so many years thinking he had lost everything when she died. But now, sitting beside her in this place beyond time, he finally understood. Love was never lost. It was always there, waiting. Eddie sat with Marguerite beneath the golden tree, his heart full in a way he had not felt for years. The pain of losing her had been a heavy burden. But now, sitting beside her, he felt lighter. She had told him that love does not end, that it changes but never disappears. He thought about that as he held her hand, feeling the warmth of her touch once more. For so long, he had believed that love was something that could be taken away. When Marguerite died, it had felt like the world had lost its color. The days became routine, the nights empty. He had gone to work, walked through life, but he had never truly lived again. He had carried her memory, but he had also carried his grief. Marguerite turned to him, her eyes filled with understanding. You never let yourself be happy again, she said softly. Eddie looked down. He knew she was right. After she had passed, nothing had felt the same. He had blamed fate, had been angry at the world. He had thought that without her, there was no joy left for him. Marguerite placed a gentle hand on his face. Love should not be a burden, Eddie, she said. It should not weigh you down. It should lift you. Eddie felt a lump in his throat. He had never thought about it that way. He had spent years thinking that his grief was proof of how much he had loved her. But what if love was not supposed to be something that made him suffer? What if love was meant to be something that gave him strength? Marguerite looked out over the field, the golden light surrounding them. Do you remember when we first met? She asked. Eddie smiled faintly. Of course, he said. At the carnival, I saw you through the tent. You were with your friends. She nodded. And do you remember what you told me that night? Eddie thought back. The memory was clear in his mind, as if it had happened yesterday. I told you I would never love anyone else, he said quietly. Marguerite smiled. And you kept that promise. Eddie sighed. But I lost you. Marguerite shook her head. You didn't lose me, Eddie. I was always with you. Eddie's chest tightened. He had spent so many years believing that love was something fragile, something that could be taken away. But sitting here with her, he realized something. Love was not just in the moments they had shared. It was in the way he had carried her with him, even after she was gone. It was in the way he had remembered her, in the way he had honored the life they had together. Marguerite turned back to him. Eddie, do you know why I am here? He looked at her, confused. Because I love you, he said simply. She smiled. Yes, and because I need to teach you one more thing. Eddie waited. Marguerite took a breath. Forgiveness, she said. Eddie frowned. Forgiveness. She nodded. You need to forgive yourself, Eddie. Eddie blinked. For what? Marguerite gave him a sad smile. For believing that your life was nothing after I was gone. For thinking that love had left you. For all the years you spent punishing yourself. Eddie looked away. Deep down, he knew she was right. He had never allowed himself to move forward. He had been stuck in his pain, believing that without her, there was nothing left for him. He had been angry at fate, at life, at himself. Marguerite squeezed his hand. You did not betray me by living, Eddie. Eddie felt his breath hitch. He had never thought about it that way. He had spent years feeling guilty, as if every moment of happiness without her was somehow wrong. But Marguerite was telling him the opposite, that his love for her was not measured by his grief, but by the way he had carried her memory. She leaned in, resting her forehead against his. I want you to know something, she whispered. I was never angry at you for living. I was only sad that you didn't let yourself live fully. Eddie's heart ached. He thought back to all the times he had turned away from happiness, from joy. He had thought it was the right thing to do, but now he saw the truth. He had not honored Marguerite by living in sorrow. He had only hurt himself. Marguerite pulled back slightly, looking into his eyes. "You don't have to carry that guilt anymore," she said. "You don't have to be trapped in the past." Eddie swallowed hard. For the first time, he saw how much he had held himself back. He had spent so many years thinking that life had ended when Marguerite did. But that was never what she had wanted for him. Tears welled in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Marguerite smiled gently. "You don't have to be." Eddie felt something shift inside him. The weight he had carried for so long was beginning to lift. The guilt, the sadness. It was fading. Marguerite touched his cheek one last time. "I love you, Eddie," she said. He took a deep breath. "I love you too." Marguerite stood up, and Eddie knew their time together here was coming to an end. But instead of feeling sorrow, he felt something else. Peace. He had learned something he had never understood before. Love did not die. It did not fade. It did not disappear. It stayed. It changed form, but it remained. And now, finally, he was ready to accept that. Marguerite took a step back, and Eddie felt the warmth of the golden light surrounding them. The wind carried her scent, the memory of their life together wrapping around him like a familiar embrace. And for the first time in years, Eddie did not feel alone. Eddie found himself in a new place, one that was unfamiliar but peaceful. He stood in the middle of a quiet landscape, surrounded by tall trees and an open sky. The air was crisp, and a soft breeze moved through the branches above. He felt lighter than before, as if some of the weight he had carried all his life had finally lifted. The sorrow that had followed him for years, the regrets, the loneliness, they were beginning to fade. Then he saw a figure standing in the distance. It was a woman, her back turned toward him, watching the horizon. Eddie took a step closer, then another. The closer he got, the more he felt something deep inside him shift. He knew this person. He had never seen her face, but he knew exactly who she was. She turned slowly, and Eddie's heart tightened. It was Tala, the little girl from the Philippines, the child he had unknowingly killed in the fire during the war, the child he had never been able to forget. Eddie stood frozen. His hands trembled. He had spent his whole life believing he had done something unforgivable, something beyond redemption. And now here she was, standing before him. Tala smiled softly. She was young, just as she had been the day of the fire. Her eyes were filled with innocence, but there was no anger in them, no blame. She simply looked at him with a quiet understanding. Eddie's voice caught in his throat. He started, but he couldn't find the words. He wanted to say he was sorry, but even that felt too small for what he had done. Tala took a step closer. "Eddie," she said gently. He swallowed hard. I didn't know," he whispered. "I didn't know you were there." Tala nodded. "But you burn me," she said simply. Eddie felt like he had been struck. The truth of those words hit him harder than anything else in his life. He had spent years pushing the thought away, trying to convince himself that the shadow in the flames had been nothing. But now there was no escaping it. He had taken an innocent life. Tears filled his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." Tala did not look away. She watched him for a moment, then reached out her small hands. "Come," she said. Eddie hesitated. He didn't think he had the right to go near her, to accept any kindness from her. But something about the way she looked at him made him step forward. She led him to the water. A clear, shallow stream ran through the land, its surface shimmering in the soft light. Without speaking, Tala picked up a small stone and handed it to Eddie. He looked at her, confused. "Wash," she said. Eddie looked down at the stone, then at the water. He knelt by the edge and dipped his hands into the cool stream. The water felt clean, pure. He rubbed the stone against his hands, and as he did, he saw something remarkable. The scars on his skin, the burns, the cuts, the marks of war and pain, began to fade. The years of suffering that had left their marks on his body were being washed away. The more he scrubbed, the lighter he felt. Tala watched him, her face calm. "You wash for me?" she said softly. Eddie's breath caught. She wasn't just asking him to wash his skin. She was asking him to cleanse his soul, to let go of the guilt, the pain, the burden he had carried for so long. Tears streamed down his face as he continued. He scrubbed harder, as if he could erase the years of regret, the nightmares, the shame, and as he did, he realized something. Tala was not here to punish him. She was not here to make him suffer. She was here to set him free. For so long, Eddie had believed that his life was worthless, that he had done nothing but work at a small amusement park, fixing rides and growing old in a place where nothing truly mattered. But now, as he knelt beside this child, the child he had wronged, he understood something deeper. Tala looked at him, her eyes gentle. "You make good for many children," she said. Eddie frowned. "What?" She smiled. "The rides, the park. You keep them safe." Eddie's breath hitched. He had never thought about it that way. He had always believed he had wasted his life, that his years at Ruby Pier had meant nothing. But Tala was telling him otherwise. Every ride he had fixed, every child he had protected, it had all mattered. "You keep them safe," she repeated. Eddie let out a shaky breath. The years of regret, the feeling that he had been nothing, that he had failed. Tala was showing him that he had done more than he had ever realized. For so long, he had thought he was only repairing machines, But in reality, he had been protecting lives. He had been making sure no child suffered the way Tala had. He had spent his entire life trying to make up for something he didn't even know he had done. Tala reached out and touched his hands. "You good?" she whispered. Eddie closed his eyes. He had never felt this before. A sense of peace, a sense of understanding. He had spent his whole life thinking he had been cursed, but maybe, just maybe, he had been given a purpose. Tala smiled, and as she did, the landscape around them began to change. The trees shimmered, the water sparkled, and the air felt warmer. Eddie felt his heart grow light. He was ready for whatever came next. Eddie stood in the middle of a vast, endless white space. The warmth of Tala's presence still lingered in his heart. But she was gone now. The place around him was silent, peaceful. It was neither sky nor ground, but something in between. Felt like the end of something, yet also like a new beginning. For a long moment, he stood still, waiting, wondering what was next. He had met the 5 people who were meant to teach him the hidden truths of his life. Each had shown him something he had never understood before. How every life is connected, how sacrifice has meaning, how love never dies, and how his life, even in its smallest moments, had mattered more than he ever knew. As Eddie looked around, he realized he was no longer in the body he had known. He did not feel the pain in his knee. His back was not sore. His hands, which had once been rough from years of work, were smooth again. He felt young, strong, whole. He was not the old man who had died at Ruby Pier. He was the Eddie of long ago, the one who had once run through the amusement park as a child, filled with laughter and wonder. Then, a familiar sound filled the air, the distant hum of voices, the soft chime of carnival music, the gentle crash of ocean waves. Eddie turned toward the sound, and in an instant he was no longer standing in the white space. He was back at Ruby Pier. But this was not the Ruby Pier he had known. It was brighter, more beautiful, more perfect. The sky stretched endlessly in shades of deep blue and gold, as if caught in an eternal sunset. The ride stood tall, shining and new. The scent of popcorn and salt water filled the air, and all around him, people walked and laughed, their faces glowing with joy. Eddie stepped forward, drawn by the sound of children's laughter. He saw them running between the rides, their eyes filled with excitement. But something was different. These were not just any children. They were the children he had kept safe. Every face was one he had unknowingly protected over the years. Every small body belonged to someone who had once been on a ride he had inspected, a ride he had made sure was secure. These were the children who had gone home safe because of him, the ones who had never known his name, never seen his face, but who had been touched by his work in ways they would never realize. Tears filled Eddie's eyes. He had spent his life believing he had been nothing more than a maintenance man, that he had lived an ordinary, meaningless life. But now he saw the truth. His life had never been meaningless. He had saved lives. He had protected children. He had made a difference. A voice called his name, and Eddie turned. Standing before him was a woman. Her dark hair framed her soft, familiar face. Her eyes, full of love, met his. Eddie's heart swelled. It was Marguerite. She was just as she had been when they had first fallen in love. Young, radiant, beautiful. Her smile was warm, and her presence filled him with a joy he had not known since the day he lost her. Eddie took a shaky step forward, afraid that if he moved too quickly, she might disappear like a dream. But she didn't. She was real. She was here. Marguerite reached out, and Eddie took her hand. It was warm, soft, just as he remembered. He looked into her eyes, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he was home. She smiled gently. "I have been waiting for you," she said. Eddie swallowed hard. Is this heaven?" Marguerite nodded. "This is your heaven, Eddie." He glanced around at Ruby Pier, at the children, at the golden sky. "But why here?" Marguerite squeezed his hand. "Because this is where you made a difference. This is where you touched lives. This is where you belonged." Eddie felt his chest tighten. All his life, he had wanted to escape Ruby Pier. He had thought of it as a trap, a place he had been stuck in, a place that had stolen his dreams. But now he understood. Ruby Pier had never been his prison. It had been his purpose. He looked at Marguerite again, his heart full. "Did I save the little girl?" he asked softly. Marguerite smiled. "Yes, Eddie, you saved her." A breath of relief escaped him. He had done something good. He had left the world a little better than he had found it. He had mattered. Marguerite led him forward, toward the bright horizon where the light was warm and inviting. Eddie knew, without being told, that this was where he was meant to go next. But before he stepped into the light, he looked back one last time. He saw the amusement park, the children playing, the waves crashing onto the shore, and he saw himself, not as he had been in life, but as he would be remembered, a man who had spent his days fixing things, making things right, a man whose small acts had changed the course of countless lives, a man who, in the end, had not been forgotten. Eddie turned to Marguerite, his heart lighter than it had ever been. He took her hand, and together, they stepped into the light.